think about national security and security in a far broader way that encompasses, the kind of insecurity that people around the United States are living on a daily basis because they don't have access to healthcare, because they don't have access to housing or affordable housing, because they don't have food, because they don't have high quality education guaranteed. These are forms of insecurity that people are living with because the US government has invested in a war machine.
Aloha. Our topic today is the largest government agency in the United States, the Department of Defense, a global institution with some 3 million employees and more than $1 trillion in annual expenditures. Its champions argue that the U.S. military has preserved security and democracy and freedom around the world, however much that might be fraying for the better part of a century, as the U.S. emerged from World War II as the leading superpower. Our guest today, though, flips many of those assumptions and arguments upside down. With us is author and anthropologist David Vine, who has written a trilogy of books on U.S. military history, one on the long history of American war from conquest of the continent and then around the world, one on the constellation of military bases that the U.S. has now assembled on every continent and across every ocean, and also a deep dive into one base in particular in the Indian Ocean, Diego Garcia. He's also done a great deal of research on the U.S. military in Hawaiʻi, and he's in Hawaiʻi participating in a research project that could inform the way Hawaiʻi negotiates with the federal government over base renewals, which is, of course, going on in Hawaiʻi right now. David, thank you so much for coming to Hawaiʻi, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Aloha, and thank you, Robert, for having me. Really a pleasure.
You spent more than a decade writing these 3 books on the U.S. military. What did you conclude as a sort of take-home findings of the 3 research projects?
I think I learned a lot personally, one would hope, after actually now almost 25 years of research about U.S. military bases, U.S. wars, and the U.S. military more broadly. I grew up, I think, like most people in the United States, believing many of the myths about the United States, about the role of the United States and the U.S. military in the world, and about U.S. wars, and the U.S. being a source of peace and democracy. And, over time, I grew more critical of those sorts of ideas. But it was really over the course of this research that I saw that, the period after 2001, when the United States began wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and Libya and Syria and Somalia and Yemen and beyond, that for a while I thought this was unusual in U.S. history, that the constant, endless wars following the attacks of 9/11 were unusual. And that is because I had believed many of the myths that tend to obscure the much longer pattern of U.S. wars that date to independence, that the United States has effectively been in one long, endless war. And my research showed that the United States military has been in one war or another, or some form of combat, in every year in U.S. history, bar approximately 11, depending on how you count a combat operation. But basically, the U.S. military has been fighting somewhere in almost every year in U.S. history, with more than 135 foreign countries and peoples. This basic fact of endless war is what defines the United States in many ways as a nation, and that's why I titled my 3rd book, The United States of War.
It's endless wars, but also endless bases. I mean, the sun really never sets on U.S. military bases around the world. What is the take-home point from what you found about the consequences of of having, I think, the first truly global military, the Brits notwithstanding?
Yeah, I would say the British Empire, was the empire upon which the sun never set. But the United States has created a global network of bases, of military bases, unlike any the world has ever seen. And this also was new to me. I vaguely, growing up, knew that the U.S. government and the U.S. military had bases in places like Germany and Okinawa, Japan, Italy, elsewhere. But beginning to think critically about why there are so many bases around the world, what they're doing, what impacts they're having, led me to realize that the United States collection of global bases is again the largest in world history, larger than any empire, people, or country in world history, the collection of bases on foreign territory, on other people's lands. And the question is, there are several important questions, beginning with what are these bases doing? Are they essential to national security, has been long claimed? Are they defending the United States, providing peace and security to anyone else? My research showed that, in fact, the case is that often this global collection of bases is actually undermining U.S. national security, beginning with the costs of these bases, but quickly extending to the way in which this global network of bases has, far from being defensive in nature, has actually allowed and made easier the perpetuation of this state of endless war, that foreign bases have been launch pads for war, by and large, offensive wars, rather than being defensive in nature.
And in a kukui nutshell, how does Hawaii sort of fit into this global history?
Hawaii is, I think, symbolic of many of the larger patterns and sadly illustrates many of the larger patterns, beginning with why did the U.S. military end up here in the first place? The U.S. military, as most certainly here in Hawaii know, played a key role in overthrowing the Hawaiian monarchy. And there was no war per se, but the U.S. military played a direct role in that regime change. And subsequently played a key role in launching other wars in the Asia-Pacific region and in advancing specifically corporate interests, first here in Hawaii itself, in advancing the interests of the big five families, corporations, and then advancing the interests of U.S. corporations and wealthy elites in the Asia-Pacific region more broadly. Why was the U.S. military, why were U.S. leaders, more precisely, interested in putting bases on islands in many parts of the Pacific in the 19th century? There was an interest in dominating Asian markets, that is, via U.S. corporations. And bases played a key role in supporting those business interests, advancing those business interests, in addition to advancing the interests on islands like Hawaii. And I would say, sorry to interrupt, I would say that pattern that one sees in the 19th century is the pattern that exists to this day, which is to say that U.S. bases around the world are, by and large, not there to protect local people. They're not there to protect the United States. They are advancing business interests. They're advancing oil interests in the greater Middle East. They're advancing the interests of U.S. corporations on a global basis, including in the interest of continuing to, if not dominate Asian markets, play a significant role in reaping profits from Asian markets.
There are now some 700 bases outside of the United States, or roughly?
Yes, roughly. By my best count, somewhere between 750 and 800 U.S. military bases outside the 50 states and Washington, D.C.
And that includes little installations or only kind of consequential?
Well, they're all consequential especially when they're occupying other people's lands. But indeed, from relatively small radar installations to massive city-sized bases with tens of thousands of troops and family members.
And that's a remarkable number, especially since, how many do other important powers in the world have? Russia or China, for example?
A great question. The U.S. military has approximately 75 to 85% of the world's foreign military bases. So China has probably around 3 foreign military bases: Djibouti, maybe in Tajikistan and Cambodia, but those latter
They're
two
kind
are
of classified or intelligent bases
they're
or something?
relatively small, more like a port facility in Cambodia. They have created some military installations, bases on human-made islands in the South China Sea.
Okay.
And they have bases in Chinese-occupied Tibet. But outside of that, there are no other Chinese bases encircling the globe. Russia has some bases, mostly in probably now exclusively in former Soviet republics. They formerly had bases in Syria, but I think all of those have been evicted by now. They may have one or two in Africa, but a small handful, nothing like the collection of 750 to 800 bases. France and Britain are the other two countries that have a few dozen.
And like some of those were assembled in the end of the Spanish-American War, and then like the defeat of Germany in World War One. But does it really accelerate in World War Two and the Cold War, like where you get into a truly global and massive scale?
World War II is the moment where what many call the empire of bases was created. There are, it's important to note, U.S. military bases around the globe in very small numbers, dating to the early 19th century. And then Hawaii really marks the acceleration in the pattern of base construction that continues with the war in the Philippines, the war with Spain in 1898, some small base acquisition in Latin America in the early 20th century. But it's really during World War II that the United States government creates a global network of bases far larger than any empire, people, or country in world history. After World War II, that network of bases consolidates, shrinks as part of demobilization at the end of the war, but the basic structure of bases remains in place, and it remains in place throughout the Cold War, growing in size in some places during the U.S. wars in Korea and Southeast Asia, Vietnam, and then growing in size particularly in the greater Middle East beginning in the late 1970s. And this is a network that, of course, expands even further and more dramatically following the attacks of September 11, 2001, and the beginning of the U.S. wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other parts of the greater Middle East.
And maintaining that infrastructure, does the DoD do its own accounting, or is that really you who's had to do some of this accounting, estimating how much that all costs annually in taxpayer dollars, which I understand is $100 billion, something like?
Around, somewhere between 80 and 100 billion, and it is hard to say precisely for a variety of reasons, beginning with the fact that the Pentagon, the Department of War, as Trump now calls it, can't keep track of its own money. It's the only government agency that hasn't been able to pass an audit. It certainly has not tracked spending on bases abroad accurately. It hasn't even tracked the sheer number of bases, and that's part of why I provide an estimate of 750 to 800 U.S. bases outside the 50 states and Washington, D.C. Part of it is how one defines a base. Part of it is that a goodly number of these bases are secretive in nature, so the Pentagon, somewhat understandably, doesn't want to advertise them, but also host nations often want to hide their existence from their own populations. But for a variety of reasons, it's difficult to have a precise number, but it is clear that the Pentagon's own list of foreign bases is incomplete and imprecise, as is their very minimal accounting of the costs. But it's important to say that $80 to $100 billion a year in spending on bases abroad is larger than almost every government agency other than the Pentagon itself and the Veterans Administration.
Right. Yeah, that's a lot of, that would be a lot of financial aid for students in college, for
Precisely.
example.
It could easily pay for free college for all and is much larger than the budget of the State Department, which is a reminder that U.S. bases abroad are, as some people say, foreign policy written in concrete. This is the infrastructure of U.S. foreign policy. U.S. foreign policy has been dominated by the U.S. military, by war making, really, especially since World War II. And all the while, U.S. infrastructure to support diplomacy, negotiations, peace building has been impoverished. And
Yeah, and I know that's true in personnel. Like the DoD just has more individual country experts on, say, Qatar or Kyrgyzstan than the State Department has, and that must be triply so after the Trump administration cuts.
that is likely the case. And you add in the CIA, and the discrepancy is even larger.
Okay, so focusing on the cost to the United States for a moment, there are the taxpayer dollars and the debt service on those dollars that are being spent on maintaining this remarkable global infrastructure. But there's also, I think it's important that you point out all these other costs too. For example, the stresses on families that are deployed abroad, or the money that stimulates infrastructure and spending and economies in places other than the U.S. How should we think of some of those auxiliary costs of forward deployment?
I think we have to think about them as broadly as possible and really look carefully at the costs that these bases are inflicting. Basically, there has been a deeply ingrained assumption among U.S. foreign policy making elites and people in the media and beyond for a long time that the U.S. must maintain hundreds of military bases and hundreds of thousands of troops around the world to protect and ensure U.S. national security. And that has just been a matter of really faith and of belief, and have been a kind of orthodoxy that has not been questioned for too long. Beginning with the cost, many I interviewed as part of my book, Base Nation, simply believed that, these bases don't cost us much, well, why not just keep them there? When in fact, they're costing much more than a comparable base in the 50 states in Washington, D.C. So the financial costs are a place to start, but there are, as you implied, there are very serious costs being borne by the people in local communities and host nations, beginning with the kinds of environmental costs that people in Hawaii know all too well, with the fuel spill at Red Hill. This, of course, is not unique to Hawaii. Many parts of the United States have seen military bases cause very serious damage to local soil, water, air, and beyond. This pattern is even more pronounced abroad. The U.S. military has tended to be even less careful in taking care of the local environments around bases overseas.
Well, yeah, so there's one set of ledgers concerns the dollars expended, the U.S. taxpayer dollars. The other ledgers, thinking of it like an economist, are the consequences of hosting or having it foisted upon you a military base in your own country, whether it's Okinawa or Korea or Germany or anywhere else. Like how, what is the clearest way economically for other countries to think of how that all comes out net? Like on the one hand, there's the spending that comes into their economies. On the other hand, there might be dangers and spills and opportunity costs lost. So is that part of your work, or who others are trying to do that math?
No, it's absolutely part of my work. It's difficult to have a precise equation, but that's exactly the way that we should be thinking about it, and other countries hosting U.S. bases should be thinking about it. So there are costs like accidents and crimes committed by U.S. military personnel. Frequently, bases are defended as and assumed to be economic boons. We hear this here in Hawaii. People talk about the economy collapsing if it weren't for the U.S. military. We hear about the supposed gifts, really, of the economic gift of having U.S. bases on your soil. The economic benefits of bases have been grossly exaggerated, and the Pentagon has been a key proponent in exaggerating the economic benefits. There are economic benefits. These bases cost a lot of money, and that money has to go somewhere.
Right.
It goes disproportionately to very large contractors who make very large profits off these bases, and that's one of the reasons they've stayed in place for so long, not because of any real national security reason. Some locals including here in Hawaii, they get jobs on bases. Local businesses benefit in some ways when more people go to restaurants, bars. But if you stop for a second and ask yourself, have these bases created thriving, robust economies? You need only walk outside the gates of many bases within the United States and outside the United States, and you find red light districts. You do not find communities that appear to be thriving economically speaking. And the red light districts are part of a pattern of often exploitative sex work industries that one finds surrounding bases. This has especially been the case in places like Okinawa and South Korea, so as well as during the Vietnam War in the Philippines, in Vietnam itself. Very troubling and at times, deadly for the women involved. But this long-standing pattern of exploitative sex work going on. These are costs, the environmental costs that we talked about before, that are borne by host nations, not by the U.S. military itself. And then the way in which U.S. bases implicate host nations and locals in U.S. wars. Again, these bases that are frequently promoted as being either economic gifts or gifts of security. At times, people say they spread democracy, which is also a claim that is incredibly dubious, if not just outright untrue. These bases have been offensive platforms for wars that local communities and host nations are then implicated in.
I was struck by your chapter on Guantanamo, but I know it's true from friends who've been at Bagram and other bases, like how much a kind of suburban 50s fantasy of America gets fabricated in these locations. And that also must have consequences if all of the PX goods are from U.S. corporations and people are eating at Pizza Hut and Taco Bell, then it's not like Afghani food trucks are benefiting as much as they might, were there more kind of like integration or interest in cultural cross communication.
Exactly. You can buy lederhosen, German lederhosen on U.S. bases. You can buy all your German gifts you don't have to leave the base, and they're designed that way, which also means that U.S. corporations make a lot of the profits off these bases. Again, there are some local corporations, German corporations or Japanese corporations that make lots of money building and maintaining bases as well. But again, the economic benefits have been grossly exaggerated, in particular because of the way in which military spending, generally speaking, is a very poor job creator. It's a very poor economic development strategy. Research by the Cost of War Project has shown repeatedly that, and Cost of War Project is at Brown University and has been documenting the costs of post 9/11 wars. They've shown that if you invest $1 million or $1 billion in the military, you create far fewer jobs than if you invest the same amount of money in education, in healthcare, in infrastructure. So military spending of all kinds is a poor job creator. It is a poor job creator when you're building and maintaining bases. It's a poor job creator for foreign countries. If you just have to think about who's employed mostly on a U.S. military base abroad, it's mostly U.S. citizens.
Right, and what could Okinawa be doing otherwise, if not for...
And Okinawa is a great example of that. Okinawa and the Japanese government have been able to get back significant plots of land from the U.S. military and have transformed those former base sites into far more economically productive uses. Schools, shopping in some cases, housing, business parks that have generated far more economic activity, far more profits, and far more jobs. And it's not unique to Okinawa. You see this around the world, and you see it actually within the United States when bases have closed. By and large, communities end up at least as well off and frequently better off than when the base was in operation.
And that's true within the U.S. too, San Francisco. And
the Presidio.
Yeah, it just is one obvious big example.
Yes, at the foot of the Golden Gate Bridge, and a base was there and played a key role in the war in 1898 with Spain and was linked to Hawaii and in transporting troops to the Philippines. This base has been transformed into a beautiful space where there's housing, there are museums, offices, schools, and a thriving community, parkland. It's really quite gorgeous.
I want to shift to oceans and islands, but before getting to the Pacific, stop at Diego Garcia, which of all of these bases, you decided to write a whole volume in your trilogy on that. I wonder if you might orient us a bit historically and geographically on the history of Diego Garcia as a community, and then how it became a British U.S. military installation, and what the consequences were for the population that had developed.
Indeed, it's an unusual but sadly not unique story in this global network of bases, and it is the story that opened my eyes to the global network of U.S. military bases around the world and what they're doing and the impacts they're having. I got a very lucky phone call at the beginning of my experience in graduate school from some lawyers who asked me to do some research. For lawsuits they were bringing against the U.S. and British governments. What they told me, a story I'd never heard, was that during the creation of a very large U.S. Air Force and Navy base on the island of Diego Garcia in the middle of the Indian Ocean in the late 1960s and early 1970s, the U.S. government, with the help of the British government, forcibly removed the entire local indigenous Chagosian people. The people occupied Diego Garcia and the surrounding Chagos Islands, hence the name Chagosian. These are islands that are very isolated, halfway between Africa and Indonesia, 900 miles south of India. Very few people know of the Chagos Islands or Diego Garcia. I vaguely knew of Diego Garcia from the first U.S. Gulf War with Iraq.
Yeah, because it was used as a torture site, right? Or as a black box kind of waterboarding site during the Second Iraq War?
We still don't know the full truth. It is harder to get to Diego Garcia than Guantanamo Bay. I've done research at Guantanamo Bay on 2 occasions. No one can go to Diego Garcia unless you're in the U.S. military or the British military. They have kept it off limits to even journalists, with very rare exceptions, for decades, and for a whole variety of reasons, including the kind of military activities that they're involved in, but also to cover up this real conspiracy. Conspiracy theorists have given conspiracies a bad name. And this was a real conspiracy where the U.S. and British government officials, and my book Island of Shame details this, and lawsuits and other journalists have documented it as well, that U.S. and British government officials conspired to exile the entire Chagosian people as part of the creation of this base for which the U.S. military paid the British government $14 million. And the people, the Chagosians, were dumped in exile 1,200 miles away from their homeland in the western Indian Ocean islands of Mauritius and the Seychelles. And they've remained there to this day, struggling to go back home, and actually are, in very encouraging news, are closer to going back to all their islands except Diego Garcia. By the end of the year, we hope that will be finalized as a result of a treaty signed between the British government and the Mauritian government and supported by the U.S.
But still, this is 60 years of exile.
This is exactly, and it is not alone. I've been able to document more than 20 cases in which local people, almost always indigenous people, have been displaced by the creation of a U.S. military base or the expansion of a U.S. military base.
Or in the case of Bikini, obliteration.
Precisely.
I guess that doesn't count as a base, but
not a base.
It is military depopulation.
Exactly, a kind of military installation. And of course, here in Hawaii, we've seen this kind of displacement as well. Similarly, in Okinawa and Guam and other parts of the Marianas, this is a longstanding pattern. And one, of course, it's important to point out that is not the 20 cases, 24 to be precise, are just since 1898, since the seizure of Hawaii and the islands seized during the 1898 war with Spain. But this follows, of course, approximately 100 years during which the U.S. military and U.S. military bases, U.S. Army forts, played a key role in displacing and dispossessing Native American peoples on the continent as part of the colonization process that, of course, included the death and murder of millions of Native American peoples. So we see a clear line connecting the displacement of Indigenous people on the continent with the displacement of people in the past roughly 125 years as part of the creation and expansion of U.S. bases. And, of course, the racism underlying this pattern.
Well, the history of Diego Garcia is so kind of like tragic and perverse in that the islands were originally populated, right, as part of the expansion of slave agriculture in the French Empire. So the progenitors of the people who were later displaced by the U.S. were also displaced forcibly by empire.
Indeed, this is a story of people who, as a people, have been displaced on multiple occasions. The Chagosians' ancestors arrived in the Chagos Islands in the late 18th century, around the time of the American Revolution, brought to the islands as enslaved people from today's Mozambique and Madagascar, and later joined by indentured Indians brought from the subcontinent, who over time created a new and distinct people, intermarried.
And a new kind of Creole language.
Indeed. And who came to be known and recognized as a distinct people to this day, are now recognized as an indigenous people by other indigenous peoples. And again, have, despite their exile and being dumped in exile with no resettlement assistance, it's important to note, while billions of dollars have been invested in the base on Diego Garcia, the people have been struggling as other displaced peoples struggle, and despite being very small in number, are on the verge of winning a historic victory, even if it's a partial victory or incomplete.
That shows that victories can come slow but can still come.
Indeed.
So in the Pacific, are maybe the displacements in the Marshall Islands most similar to Diego Garcia, or?
There were a number that are similar, but people in Okinawa were displaced not just during World War II, but after World War II, running into the 1950s. Some of them displaced as far away as Bolivia, of all places. In that case and others, it was portrayed as being a voluntary migration. There was nothing particularly voluntary about it. People were given little choice. Chagosians were given no choice and rounded up and put on overcrowded cargo ships. In the Marshalls, indeed, there was also no choice involved when the U.S. carried out nuclear testing in multiple atolls in the Marshall Islands, and people were displaced, as well as the kind of nuclear radiation effects that many in the Marshalls suffered. Again, Guam, Greenland, there's a case there. The only case in the 24 cases I've been able to document that involves a population we'd identify as white or Euro-American was one case in Canada during World War II.
So Hawaii now is in the process of trying to renegotiate these leases that were for huge acreage, a huge portion of the archipelago that is controlled by the U.S. military. How do you think your research and kind of perspective on bases and military and their stated but maybe not always honestly stated purposes should shape the way that state leaders pursue those negotiations and activists who are seeking or hoping to have their voices included in those negotiations should proceed?
I hope my research can be helpful to all of the above. This lease agreement that it seems to me was imposed on the state of Hawaii in 1964, 65-year leases for a grand total of $1 for, we're talking, around 47,000 acres of land. I'm conducting a few pieces of research to hopefully inform these negotiations. One builds off my work with the Chagosians. As part of that work, tried to calculate the amount of compensation they are owed for having had their land stolen from them. So when indigenous people on Diego Garcia and the surrounding islands had their land, their homeland stolen from them, what's that worth? What was that land worth that they occupied, as well as what were the other economic effects of being displaced, exiled? So I've been able to use a model that I created with a couple colleagues to estimate the value of their land that was stolen, to estimate the proper value of the land that the U.S. military has been leasing for $1. I think it would be quite appropriate for people in Hawaii to demand back rent for all of those years of that the land has been occupied, 65
Which would
years.
add up, I presume.
Which would add up. So my draft estimate is that the back rent totals somewhere between $29 billion and $97 billion. A lot of money. But land on Hawaii is quite valuable, and 65 years is a lot of time, and 47,000 acres is a lot of land. The calculation is also going to allow an estimate of what proper rent would be going forward if the people of Hawaii choose to enter into new leases with the U.S. military. Although I think it's important to point out, and this has really struck me about being here, first of all, the U.S. military occupies just a massive amount of land. I've not been anywhere else other than Okinawa and Guam where I have seen mile after mile after mile occupied by U.S. military bases. Oahu, of course, is most pronounced, where perhaps as much as 25% of the island is occupied by the U.S. military.
And we have all of these progressive laws compared to other states on beach access and so on, but of course they're not at all or not fully applicable to U.S. military installations.
Yeah, the military occupies gorgeous beaches in Hawaii, and far more land than in any other state among the 50 states and Washington, D.C. So I think the people of Hawaii should think very seriously about these leases, including the record of the military not taking very good care of the land. So we can begin again with the fuel leak that was going on for years.
Right, that's
and
most
years.
obvious. But what are some of the other environmental costs that might not be top of mind as the aquifer contamination for Manito, which is obviously very serious and generational damage that has been done?
Very serious and generational damage, both to locals as well as to military personnel. And that's part of why the issue generated so much attention, and it was very encouraging sort of alliance between military families and locals. But I think there are a range of other forms of environmental damage. The land on the Big Island of Hawaii, of course, has been used as a massive training and testing area for, by the estimate I've heard, 4.8 million rounds of ammunition fired per year, 4.8 million rounds of ammunition fired per year on a piece of land the size of Guam, 133,000 acres. This is a massive slice of land. I looked at Europe to see where the U.S. military trains in Europe, and other NATO members also train in Europe. The largest training area in Europe is on a piece of land, 55,000 acres. So the U.S. military occupies, by my estimate, far, far too much land in Hawaii, and it's to the people of Hawaii, and beginning with Native Hawaiians, I think, to decide what they want to do with these leases and the U.S. military presence more broadly. But I think it's critical also to see that the daily operations on bases are bad for the environment, and this is not specific to the U.S. military. Military bases, by definition, pretty much are places that consolidate and hold large amounts of hazardous materials, fuels, chemicals,
fire retardant,
toxic materials, PFAS, things that aren't good for the environment, for humans and other living things.
So if the back rent preliminary provisional tally is some maybe tens of billions of dollars, then if you add in the remediation costs, are you seeking to come up with some amount of damage plus back rent?
The team, yes, the team that I'm part of is calculating, at least estimating the cost of cleanup. It's very difficult to estimate, but we are certainly running into the many billions of dollars. So the attempted cleanup at Kaho'olawe, the island that the U.S. military Navy used for target practice for decades.
Yeah, and is not cleaned up.
Not cleaned up, and they've spent $460 million, and they haven't even cleaned up a portion of it properly. So we are talking certainly into the many billions of dollars to clean up all the land that,
and the aquifer there may not even be repairable,
which is a tragedy. And we should also remember that, of course, land has and the environment have value beyond the economic, and that kind of sort of damage, especially again to Indigenous Native Hawaiians and their relationship to the land, is one that we can't value in a dollars and cent terms.
All of this is justified, of course, and many people believe because high U.S. military expenditures and projection of military force and deployment abroad have enjoyed pretty bipartisan support from at least World War II forward, with certainly disagreements and maybe heightening disagreements now that we'll talk about. But it's all been justified in, that it enhances security and stability.
So
what are their best cases out of the 800 bases that are deployed? What do you think are the most defensible?
There are very few. The United States, for a variety of reasons. I think there are a series of myths that surround the U.S. military and U.S. military bases that have played a role in perpetuating a status quo for bases and a status quo of endless war, where you have people in the U.S. military but far beyond the U.S. military, U.S. leaders and people in think tanks and others, the media, who are leading us down a path toward what should be an unthinkable war between the United States and China. The fact is that the United States is extraordinarily secure because of two very large oceans that surround the two coasts and also that protect Hawaii. Hawaii is quite isolated itself. The United States military is not on Hawaii to defend Hawaiians. It's not on Hawaii to defend the United States. You can defend the United States and Hawaii, for that matter, from the continental United States. The only bases, I think there was, some legitimate argument during the Cold War about U.S. bases protecting Western Europe from a Soviet threat. The Soviet military threat was a very substantial one. The Chinese military pales in comparison to the Soviet military threat. It also pales in comparison to the U.S. military, which remains the most powerful military on earth. And it's important to point out there is a myth of a Chinese military threat. And this myth is being used by people who are profiting off the march toward war, who are profiting off the military buildup of preparing for a war with China that I fear is risking becoming some kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, where when you prepare for war, it's only encouraging Chinese military leaders and Chinese government leaders to respond by building up their own military power, which is indeed what's happening, making war more likely, not less likely.
Well, that makes me think of Russia and Ukraine too. There's different ways to look at it. It's kind of paradoxical. On the one hand, if Ukraine hadn't surrendered its nukes or had joined NATO earlier, U.S. military, then maybe Ukraine would have not been invaded and been safe. On the other hand, maybe if Russia didn't feel surrounded and that NATO was expanding and encircling it, then maybe they wouldn't have, the right of Russia would have never felt like reignition of territorial conquest was the answer to their own national security problems. It's kind of, it's hard to play that game of counterfactuals, but
I think it's not, but it's not impossible. And I think it's important to point out that both Russia and China have been surrounded by a growing number of U.S. military bases since the end of the Cold War, when I think it must be said that we squandered that U.S. leaders squandered a historic opportunity for peace with Russia in particular, but also China. The money that's being poured into new arms races and new Cold Wars is a absolute tragedy and abomination, because we need to remember that the now hundreds of billions of dollars at least that are being poured into an arms buildup to compete with China and Russia, when the United States military, again, its power far exceeds those of both Russia and China combined. All that money is at the expense of other things we could have been investing that money in, like free college for all, like universal health care, like building a green infrastructure that could help save us from the worst effects of global warming, climate change, like feeding the hungry, like making sure that no one goes to sleep on the streets as they are here in Honolulu and around the country, around the corner from my house in Oakland, California. These are outrages that don't need to exist and are directly related to the way in which U.S. leaders have poured an absurd and really shameful amount of money into a military machine that is actually making what should be an unthinkable war between the United States and China at least, and perhaps the United States, China, and Russia more likely. And we need to remember that any such war between the United States and China, the United States and Russia, could easily spiral out of control into a nuclear war that could make the death and destruction of the post 9/11 wars, which was
even World
horrific,
War II.
or even World War II, make it look small because of the destructive power of nuclear weapons, and that could kill tens of millions of people if we're lucky. Sorry to be a downer.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like that one maybe tragic turning point relates to Dick Cheney, who just passed away, in that, after the Cold War, the U.S. could have decommissioned and sought to orient the world in a more collaborative and cooperative, less kind of bipolar way, but instead chose to try to assert itself as a singular global power that has then provoked all of these other countries to react in certain ways, and now here we are on the precipice of another kind of very dangerous escalation with China.
Exactly, and that's where I think the counterfactual question comes in. We can look at one case to try to imagine how U.S. leaders and the U.S. public would respond if China or Russia were to build even a single military base near the borders of the United States. Neither country has a single military base anywhere near the borders.
We had the Cuban Missile Crisis as a test for that.
Precisely. And this, led the world closer to nuclear annihilation than at any other moment till now, unfortunately.
Even closer than we knew.
Indeed. And this was when the Soviet Union built a single missile base on the island of Cuba, 90 miles from Miami. Meanwhile, again, the U.S. military has bases surrounding both Russia and China and their borders, which again are often portrayed as being defensive in nature, but are clearly intended to threaten both Russia and China, and are encouraging them to respond militarily, just as U.S. military and government leaders responded militarily during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Looking forward to the future and trying to set us on a safer trajectory, I kind of want to ask a question of what U.S. military presence around the world ought to be, but in two different frames. First of all, how could the U.S. military infrastructure abroad be more correctly sized without radically reconceiving of U.S. national security or even military doctrine? What would that what kind of scaling back would it look like just to create infrastructure that would kind of make sense within the existing philosophical presumptions, which I know you don't share?
I don't, indeed. And I do think we need to think about national security and security in a far broader way that encompasses, the kind of insecurity that people around the United States are living on a daily basis because they don't have access to healthcare, because they don't have access to housing or affordable housing, because they don't have food, because they don't have high quality education guaranteed. These are forms of insecurity that people are living with because the U.S. government has invested in a war machine since World War II. President Eisenhower warned us about the military-industrial complex when he was leaving office in 1961. This military-industrial complex has become far more powerful than when President Eisenhower left office. It's entrenched a system of permanent war, and that is a major part of why the United States has been in a series of endless wars, especially since 2001. And again, finds us in a moment where a group of really war profiteers, weapons manufacturers, and others within the military-industrial complex are the ones leading us down the path toward a war with China. I will say, to get back to your question, technological advancements, the ability to deploy forces rapidly across the globe, have advanced significantly since World War II. We have a World War II and early Cold War era strategy that has U.S. military bases encircling the globe. It does not have to be that way. The U.S. military can deploy its forces from the continental United States, in most cases, just as rapidly as from a base in Germany or Japan. So technological advancements alone could allow significant shrinking of the U.S. military base infrastructure. And it's important to say we do need to question.
Well, that's the next question. Like, so if we really did conceive of Department of Defense rather than Department of War, which they have sort of aptly renamed, if we did reconceive of protecting the population and with a different kind of philosophical orientation, how much more might it shrink than it might just by technological
I think
changes?
It could shrink dramatically, but would have to shrink in a very deliberate and intentional way that would involve drawing down and building up. By drawing down, I mean drawing down the U.S. military presence abroad, closing unnecessary bases abroad. Any base that's unnecessary is wasting taxpayer money and in many cases making the world more dangerous by fueling military tensions with other powers. So closing unnecessary bases abroad while building up diplomatic presence abroad, as well as cultural and educational forms of engagement, economic forms of engagement, recommitting much more profoundly to peace building, to negotiations, to resolving, for example, the territorial disputes in the South China Sea and elsewhere in the Pacific. These are the commitments, along with building up the infrastructure that will take care of people's insecurity within the United States. So again, building affordable housing, ensuring everyone has healthcare in our country.
Which is ironic, actually. It's like the military is the place where we actually have the social welfare state. That's like the most socialist institution we have, with the subsidized gas and golf courses and concerts and recreation facilities and healthcare for life and good educational benefits. We could think of it as a way of
expanding that for all.
Expanding that for all.
Military benefits for all. I haven't quite put it in those terms, and I'm not sure I put it in those terms. But no, the military system is quite robust in providing for people's daily existence and indeed things even like recreation, healthcare, education, and the build-up, as I was saying, drawing down bases and the fueling and funding of the war machine, drawing that down while building up infrastructure to support the lives of people in the United States would include building up the VA. So building up Veterans Administration healthcare, which in many ways is a very good system, but often leaves veterans wanting. So there's room to take care of veterans. And I just need to be clear that, I've been critiquing the U.S. military throughout our conversation, and I think it deserves critique. When I'm critiquing the U.S. military, I'm not critiquing the vast majority of members of the U.S. military. I see them as, by and large, victims of the same system of endless war, of a war machine.
Well, we sure saw that at Red Hill.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And there are some people, powerful, high-ranking officers and other government officials who are directing U.S. military policy, and that is what I am really concerned about, U.S. military policy that would better protect the lives of people in the U.S. military, while also, it's important to say, the kind of benefits that you outlined that members of the military and their families enjoy. Why is that the only way in which someone in the United States can enjoy those sorts of benefits? Why do we not have other opportunities for young people to, for example, see the world, to contribute to the common good worldwide, to enjoy free education, college and beyond, to have guaranteed health care. You shouldn't need to risk your life and join the military to get these sorts of benefits. They should be guaranteed in the wealthiest country on earth.
Last question. Hawaii is in a tricky fix negotiating with the U.S. military under the Trump administration just because it's so asymmetrical. What are some ways that Hawaii might conceive of the negotiations or mobilize for the negotiations in a way that might allow Hawaii to recoup some of these costs that you're tallying, or, develop a more genuinely mutually beneficial relationship going forward?
I think the kind of organizing we saw around Red Hill, again, organizing that involved both locals as well as military families, people both in the military and their partners and children, that is a great model and has created a kind of momentum and a kind of new critical eye on the military presence here. So I think people are ripe for demanding what they're due, which in my mind, again, is a significant reduction in the U.S. military presence on Hawaii, beginning with the leased land, although it's important to remember that the land that's leased from the state is only a relatively small proportion of the total land. But I think people need to organize across movements, across organizations, people concerned about the environment, people concerned about Native Hawaiian rights, people concerned about the military and war. The drawing down the military presence here in Hawaii actually could play a role in drawing down or tamping down tensions between the United States and China. The United States, again, can protect Hawaii, can protect the United States without a huge military presence in Hawaii. It's also as part of the myth of the China threat, which again is a kind of fear-mongering, long-standing fear-mongering that's benefiting a group of war profiteers, weapons manufacturers. The Chinese military, when was the last time it fought a war outside its own borders? The late 1970s, for 1 month. The country that has a track record of fighting wars outside its borders is, of course, the United States. Who is the threat? And I say that with no sense I say that with a sense of shame. This is the part of the pattern that we need to break, this pattern of endless war that's harming people in the United States and, of course, harming so many millions abroad. And people here in Hawaii can play a role in both protecting their land and their right to their own land, and toward ultimately protecting the United States as a whole far better by helping to reduce the military presence here and by virtue of that, reducing the global U.S. military presence, which would go a long way to avoiding, again, a war that must be avoided at all costs between the United States and China.
Thank you, David, for your research and your advocacy and your insight on the important issues for Hawaii, but also how they are relevant in a global context and in this, increasingly dangerous circumstances we find ourselves in.
Can I just
Yes.
point to one other aspect of the research that I'm doing here in Hawaii that builds off my global research about U.S. bases, which is other ways this land can be used. And again, there are cases that we can look at around the world and as well as within the United States where bases have been converted into other uses. They've been conserved as parkland. They've been conserved as places, spiritual places, culturally significant places, and they've been turned into things like affordable housing or housing of various kinds, museums. And that kind of transformation is what I'm going to be outlining, the options for people here in Hawaii and how they could differently use the roughly 47,000 acres of land currently occupied by the U.S. military.
Well, we will be looking for the research findings that you and your colleagues produce. That will be really important to kind of Hawaii positioning itself in these negotiations. So thank you in advance for that. I want to say, too, that the research they're doing is made possible by funding and support that they have from Aina Aloha Economic Futures, from the Sierra Club, from the Cost of War Project, from the Institute for Policy Studies, and the Better Tomorrow series is a joint venture of the University of Hawaii at Manoa, the Hawaiʻi Community Foundation, and Unbound Philanthropy. And I want to thank you for joining us. I had more questions, but we may talk again. And
I would love it. This
and
is
I
a
want to
great.
thank all of you for listening too. So ahui ho.
Thank you, Mahalo.
Mahalo.